Section 29 of The Green Rust by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 29: The Lost Code.
"I'm Milsom," said the man in the doorway again.
His clothes were grimed and dusty, his collar limp and soiled. There were 2 days' growth of red-gray stubble on his big jaw, and he bore himself like a man who was faint from lack of sleep. He walked unsteadily to the table and fell into a chair. "Where is Van Heerden?" asked Beale, but Milsom shook his head.
"I left him 2 hours ago, after a long and unprofitable talk on patriotism," he said, and laughed shortly. "At that time he was making his way back to his house in Southwark."
"Then he is in London, here in London." Milsom nodded.
"You won't find him," he said brusquely. "I tell you I've left him after a talk about certain patriotic misgivings on my part. Look." He lifted his right hand, which hitherto he had kept concealed by his side, and Oliva shut her eyes and felt deathly sick. "Right index digit and part of the phalanges shot away," said Milsom philosophically. "That was my trigger finger, but he shot first. Give me a drink."
They brought him a bottle of wine, and he drank it from a long tumbler in 2 great breathless gulps.
"You've closed the coast to him," he said. "You shut down your wires and cables. You're watching the roads, but he'll get his message through if..."
"Then he hasn't cabled?" said Beale eagerly. "Milsom, this means liberty for you, liberty and comfort. Tell us the truth, man. Help us hold off this horror that Van Heerden is loosing on the world, and there's no reward too great for you." Milsom's eyes narrowed.
"It wasn't the hope of reward or hope of pardon that made me break with Van Heerden," he said in his slow way. "You'd laugh yourself sick if I told you. It was the knowledge that this country would be down and out, that the people who spoke my tongue and thought more or less as I thought should be under the foot of the beast, fevered sentimentality. You don't believe that."
"I believe it." It was Oliva who spoke, and it appeared that this was the first time that Milsom had noticed her presence, for his eyes opened wider.
You believe it, do you?" and he nodded. "But why is Van Heerden waiting?" asked McNorton. "What is he waiting for?"
The big man rolled his head helplessly from side to side, and the hard cackle of his laughter was very trying to men whose nerves were raw and on edge.
"That's the fatal lunacy of it. I think it must be a national characteristic. You saw it in the war again and again, a wonderful plan brought to naught by some piece of over cleverness on the part of the superman."
A wild hope leapt to Beale's heart. "Then it has failed? The Rust has not answered?" But Milsom shook his head wearily.
"The Rust is all that he thinks, and then some," he said. "No, it isn't that. It is in the work of the organization where the hitch has occurred. You know something of the story. Van Heerden has agents in every country in the world. He has spent nearly £100,000 in perfecting his working plans, and I'm willing to admit that they are well nigh perfect. Such slight mistakes as sending men to South Africa and Australia, where the crops are 6 months later than the European and American harvests, may be forgiven, because the German thinks longitudinally, and north and south are the 2 points of the compass which he never bothers his head about. If the Germans had been a seafaring people, they'd have discovered America before Columbus, but they would never have found the North Pole or rounded the Cape in a million years." He paused, and they saw the flicker of a smile in his weary eyes. "The whole scheme is under Van Heerden's hand. At the word 'go,' thousands of his agents begin their work of destruction. But the word must come from him. He has so centralized his scheme that if he died suddenly without that word being uttered, the work of years would come to naught. I guess he is suspicious of everybody, including his new government. For the best part of a year he has been arranging and planning. With the assistance of a girl, a compatriot of his, he has reduced all things to order. In every country is a principal agent who possesses a copy of a simple code. At the proper moment Van Heerden would cable a word which meant 'get busy,' or 'hold off until you hear from me,' or 'abandon scheme for this year and collect cultures.' I happen to be word perfect in the meanings of the code words because Van Heerden has so often drummed them into me." "What are the code words?" "I'm coming to that," nodded Milsom. "Van Heerden is the type of scientist that never trusts his memory. You find that kind in all the schools. They usually spend their time making the most complete and detailed notes, and their studies are packed with memoranda. Yet he had a wonderful memory for the commonplace things. For example, in the plain English of his 3 messages he was word perfect. He could tell you offhand the names and addresses of all his agents. But when it came to scientific data his mind was a blank until he consulted his authorities. It seemed that once he made a note his mind was incapable of retaining the information he had committed to paper. That, as I say, is a phenomenon which is not infrequently met with amongst men of science." "And he had committed the code to paper?" asked Kitson. "I am coming to that. After the fire at the Paddington Works, Van Heerden said the time had come to make a getaway. He was going to the Continent. I was to sail for Canada. 'Before you go,' he said, 'I will give you the code. But I am afraid that I cannot do that until after 10 o'clock.'" McNorton was scribbling notes in shorthand and carefully circled the hour. "We went back to his flat and had breakfast together. It was then about 5 o'clock. He packed a few things, and I particularly noticed that he looked very carefully at the interior of a little grip which he had brought the previous night from Staines. He was so furtive, carrying the bag to the light of the window, that I supposed he was consulting his code, and I wondered why he would defer giving me the information until 10 o'clock. Anyway, I could swear he took something from the bag and slipped it into his pocket. We left the flat soon after and drove to a railway station, where the baggage was left. Van Heerden had given me banknotes for £1,000 in case we should be separated, and I went on to the house in South London. You needn't ask me where it is, because Van Heerden is not there." He gulped again at the wine. "At 11 o'clock Van Heerden came back," resumed Milsom, "and if ever a man was panic-stricken it was he. The long and the short of it is that the code was mislaid." "Mislaid?" Beale was staggered. Here was farce interpolated into tragedy, the most grotesque, the most unbelievable farce. "Mislaid," said Milsom. "He did not say as much, but I gathered from the few disjointed words he flung at me that the code was not irredeemably lost. In fact, I have reason to believe that he knows where it is. It was after that Van Heerden started in to do some tall cursing of me, my country, my decadent race, and the like. Things have been strained all the afternoon. Tonight they reached a climax. He wanted me to help him in a burglary, and burglary is not my forte." "What did he want to burgle?" asked McNorton, with professional interest. "Ah, there you have me. It was the question I asked and he refused to answer. I was to put myself in his hands, and there was to be some shooting if, as he thought likely, a caretaker was left on the premises to be entered. I told him flat we were sitting on Wandsworth Common at the time that he could leave me out, and that is where we became mutually offensive." He looked at his maimed hand. "I dressed it roughly at a chemist's. The iodine open dressing isn't beautiful, but it is antiseptic. He shot to kill, too, there's no doubt about that. A very perfect little gentleman." "He's in London?" said McNorton. "That simplifies matters." "To my mind it complicates rather than simplifies," said Beale. "London is a vast proposition. Can you give us any idea as to the hour the burglary was planned for?" 11, said Milsom promptly. "That is to say, in a little over an hour's time." "And you have no idea of the locality?" "Somewhere in the east of London. We were to have met at Aldgate." "I don't understand it," said McNorton. "Do you suggest that the code is in the hands of somebody who is not willing to part with it? And now that he no longer needs it for you, is there any reason why he should wait?" "Every reason," replied Milsom, and Stanford Beale nodded in agreement. "It was not only for me he wanted it. He as good as told me that unless he recovered it he would be unable to communicate with his men." "What do you think he'll do?" "He'll get Bridgers to assist him. Bridgers is a pretty sore man, and the doctor knows just where he can find him." As Oliva listened, an idea slowly dawned in her mind that she might supply a solution to the mystery of the missing code. It was a wildly improbable theory, she held, but even so slender a possibility was not to be discarded. She slipped from the group and went back to her room. For the accommodation of his ward, James Kitson had taken the adjoining suite to his own and had secured a lady's maid from an agency for the girl's service. She passed through the sitting room to her own bedroom and found the maid putting the room ready for the night. "Minnie," she said, throwing a quick glance about the apartment,
Where did you put the clothes I took off when I came?"
"Here, miss."
The girl opened the wardrobe and Oliva made a hurried search. "Did you find anything? A little ticket?" The girl smiled.
"Oh, yes, miss. It was in your stocking."
Oliva laughed. "I suppose you thought it was rather queer, finding that sort of thing in a girl's stocking?" she asked, but the maid was busily opening the drawers of the dressing table in search of something.
"Here it is, miss."
She held a small square ticket in her hand, and held it with such disapproving primness that Oliva nearly laughed.
"I found it in your stocking, miss," she said again.
"Quite right," said Oliva coolly. "That's where I put it. I always carry my pawn tickets in my stocking." The admirable Minnie sniffed. "I suppose you have never seen such a thing?" smiled Oliva. "And you hardly knew what it was." The lady's maid turned very red. She had unfortunately seen many such certificates of penury, but all that was part of her private life. And she had been shocked beyond measure to be confronted with this too familiar evidence of impecuniosity in the home of a lady who represented to her an assured income and comfortable pickings. Oliva went back to her sitting room and debated the matter. It was a sense of diffidence, the fear of making herself ridiculous, which arrested her. Otherwise she might have flown into the room, declaimed her preposterous theories, and leave these clever men to work out the details. She opened the door, and with the ticket clenched in her hand, stepped into the room. If they had missed her after she had left, nobody saw her return. They were sitting in a group about the table, firing questions at the big unshaven man who had made such a dramatic entrance to the conference, and who, with a long cigar in the corner of his mouth, was answering readily and fluently. But faced with the tangible workings of criminal investigation, her resolution and her theories shrank to vanishing point. She clasped the ticket in her hand and felt for a pocket, but the dressmaker had not provided her with that useful appendage. So she turned and went softly back to her room, praying that she would not be noticed. She closed the door gently behind her and turned to meet a well-valeted man in evening dress who was standing in the middle of the room, a light overcoat thrown over his arm, his silk hat tilted from his forehead, a picture of calm assurance. "Don't move," said Van Heerden, "and don't scream. And be good enough to hand over the pawn ticket you are holding in your hand." Silently she obeyed, and as she handed the little pasteboard across the table which separated them, she looked past him to the bookshelf behind his head, and particularly to a new volume which bore the name of Stanford Beale. End of chapter 29. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Section 30 of The Green Rust by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 30. The Watch. "Thanks," said Van Heerden, pocketing the ticket. "It is of no use to me now, for I cannot wait. I gather that you have not disclosed the fact that this ticket is in your possession?" "I don't know how you gathered that," she said.
"Lower your voice," he hissed menacingly. "I gather as much because Beale knew the ticket would not be in my possession now. If he only knew, if he only had a hint of its existence, I fear my scheme would fail. As it is, it will succeed. And now," he said with a smile, "time is short and your preparations must be of the briefest. I will save you the trouble of asking questions by telling you that I am going to take you along with me. I certainly cannot afford to leave you. Get your coat." With a shrug she walked past him to the bedroom, and he followed.
"Are we going far?" she asked.
There was no tremor in her voice, and she felt remarkably self-possessed. "That you will discover," said he.
"I am not asking out of idle curiosity, but I want to know whether I ought to take a bag."
"Perhaps it would be better," he said. She carried the little attaché case back to the sitting room.
"You have no objection to my taking a little light reading matter?" she said contemptuously. "I am afraid you are not a very entertaining companion, Dr. Van Heerden."
"Excellent girl," said Van Heerden cheerfully. "Take anything you like." She slipped a book from the shelf and nearly betrayed herself by an involuntary exclamation as she felt its weight.
"You are not very original in your methods," she said. "This is the second time you have spirited me off."
"The jails of England, as your new-found friend Milsom will tell you, are filled with criminals who departed from the beaten tracks,"
said Van Heerden. "Walk out into the corridor and turn to the right. I will be close behind you. A little way along you will discover a narrow passage which leads to the service staircase. Go down that. I am sure you believe me when I say that I will kill you if you attempt to make any signal or scream or appeal for help." She did not answer. It was because of this knowledge and this fear which was part of her youthful equipment, for violent death is a very terrible prospect to the young and the healthy, that she obeyed him at all. They walked down the stone stairs, through an untidy, low-roofed lobby, redolent of cooking food, into the street, without challenge and without attracting undue notice. Van Heerden's car was waiting at the end of the street, and she thought she recognized the chauffeur as Bridgers. "Once more we ride together," said Van Heerden gaily, "and what will be the end of this adventure for you depends entirely upon your loyalty. What are you opening your bag for?" he asked, peering in the dark. "I am looking for a handkerchief," said Oliva. "I am afraid I am going to cry." He settled himself back in the corner of the car with a sigh of resignation, accepting her explanation. Sarcasm was wholly wasted on Van Heerden. "Well, gentlemen," said Milsom, "I don't think there's anything more I can tell you. What are you going to do with me?" "I'll take the responsibility of not executing the warrant," said McNorton. "You will accompany one of my men to his home to night, and you will be under police supervision." "That's no new experience," said Milsom. "There's only one piece of advice I want to give you." "And that is?" asked Beale. "Don't underrate van Heerden. You have no conception of his nerve. There isn't a man of us here," he said, "whose insurance rate wouldn't go up to 90% if van Heerden decided to get him. I don't profess that I can help you to explain his strange conduct to day. I can only outline the psychology of it. But how and where he has hidden his code and what circumstances prevent its recovery is known only to van Heerden." He nodded to the little group, and accompanied by McNorton left the room. "There goes a pretty bad man," said Kitson, "or I am no judge of character. He's an old lag, isn't he?" Beale nodded. "Murder," he said laconically. "He lived after his time. He should have been a contemporary of the Borgias." "A poisoner!" shuddered one of the undersecretaries. "I remember the case. He killed his nephew and defended himself on the plea that the youth was a degenerate, as he undoubtedly was." "He might have got that defense passed in America or France," said Beale, "but unfortunately there was a business end to the matter. He was the sole heir of his nephew's considerable fortune, and a jury from the Society of Eugenics would have convicted him on that." He looked at his watch and turned his eyes to Kitson. "I presume Miss Cresswell is bored and has retired for the night?" he said. "I'll find out in a moment," said Kitson. "Did you speak to her?" Beale nodded, and his eyes twinkled. "Did you make any progress?" "I broke the sad news to her, if that's what you mean." "You told her she was married to you? Good heavens! What did she say?" "Well, she didn't faint. I don't think she's the fainting kind. She is cursed with a sense of humour and refused even to take a tragic view." "That's bad," said Kitson, shaking his head. "A sense of humour is out of place in a divorce court, and that is where your little romance is going to end, my friend." "I'm not so sure," said Beale calmly, and the other stared at him. "You have promised me," he began, with a note of acerbity in his voice. "And you have advised me," said Beale. Kitson choked down something which he was going to say, but which he evidently thought was better left unsaid. "Wait," he commanded. "I will find out whether Miss Cresswell," he emphasized the words, "has gone to bed." He passed through the door to Oliva's sitting room and was gone a few minutes. When he came back, Beale saw his troubled face and ran forward to meet him. "She's not there," said Kitson. "Not in her room?" "Neither in the sitting room nor the bedroom. I have rung for her maid. Oh, here you are." Prim Minnie came through the bedroom door. "Where is your mistress?" "I thought she was with you, sir." "What is this?" said Beale, stooped and picked up a white kid glove. "She surely hasn't gone out," he said in consternation. "That's not a lady's glove, sir," said the girl. "That is a gentleman's." It was a new glove, and turning it over he saw stamped inside the words Glebler, Rotterdam. "Has anybody been here?" he asked. "Not to my knowledge, sir. The young lady told me she did not want me any more to night." The girl hesitated. It seemed a veritable betrayal of her mistress to disclose such a sordid matter as the search for a pawn ticket. Beale noticed the hesitation. "You must tell me everything and tell me quickly," he said.
"Well, sir," said the maid, "the lady came in to look for something she brought with her when she came here." "I remember," cried Kitson. "She told me she had brought away something very curious from Van Heerden's house and made me guess what it was. Something interrupted our talk. What was it?" "Well, sir," said the maid, resigned, "I won't tell you a lie, sir. It was a pawn ticket."
"A pawn ticket?" cried Kitson and Beale in unison. "Are you sure?" asked the latter.
"Absolutely sure, sir." "But she couldn't have brought a pawn ticket from Van Heerden's house. What was it for?" "I beg your pardon, sir?" "What was on the pawn ticket?" said Kitson impatiently. "What article had been pledged?" Again the girl hesitated. To betray her mistress was unpleasant. To betray herself, as she would if she confessed that she had most carefully and thoroughly read the voucher, was unthinkable. "You know what was on it," said Beale, in his best third degree manner. "Now don't keep us waiting. What was it?" "A watch, sir."
"How much was it pledged for?"
10 shillings, sir."
"Do you remember the name?"
"In a foreign name, sir. Van Heerden."
"Van Heerden," said Beale quickly, "and at what pawnbroker's?"
"Well, sir," said the girl, making a fight for her reputation, "I only glanced at the ticket and I only noticed—"
"Yes, you did," interrupted Beale sharply. "You read every line of it. Where was it?"
"Rosenbaum Brothers of Commercial Road," blurted the girl.
"Any number?"
"I didn't see the number." "You will find them in the telephone book," said Kitson. "What does it mean?" But Beale was halfway to Kitson's sitting room, arriving there in time to meet McNorton, who had handed over his charge to his subordinate. "I've found it!" cried Beale. "Found what?" asked Kitson. "The code." "Where? How?" asked McNorton. "Unless I am altogether wrong, the code is contained, either engraved on the case or written on a slip of paper enclosed within the case of a watch. Can't you see it all plainly now? Van Heerden neither trusted his memory nor his subordinates. He had his simple code written, as we shall find, upon thin paper enclosed in the case of a hunter watch, and this he pledged. A pawnbroker's is the safest of safe deposits. Searching for clues, suppose the police had detected his preparations, the pledged ticket might have been easily overlooked." Kitson was looking at him with an expression of amazed indignation. Here was a man who had lost his wife, and Kitson believed that this young detective loved the girl as few women are loved. But in the passion of the chase, in the production of a new problem, he was absorbed to the exclusion of all other considerations in the greater game. Yet he did Beale an injustice if he only knew, for the thought of Oliva's new peril ran through all his speculations, his rapid deductions, his lightning plans. "Miss Cresswell found the ticket and probably extracted it as a curiosity. These things are kept in little envelopes, aren't they, McNorton?" The police chief nodded. "That was it, then. She took it out and left the envelope behind, and Van Heerden did not discover his loss until he went to find the voucher to give Milsom the code. Don't you remember? In the first place, he said he couldn't give him the code until after 10 o'clock, which is probably the hour the pawnbrokers open for business." McNorton nodded again. "Then do you remember that Milsom said that the code was not irredeemably lost and that Van Heerden knew where it was? In default of finding the ticket, he decided to burgle the pawnbrokers, and that burglary is going through to night." "But he could have obtained a duplicate of the ticket," said McNorton. "How?" asked Beale quickly. "By going before a magistrate and swearing an affidavit." "In his own name," said Beale. "You see, he couldn't do that. It would mean walking into the lion's den. No, burglary was his only chance." "And what of Oliva?" said Kitson impatiently. "I tell you, Beale, I am not big enough or stoical enough to think outside of that girl's safety." Beale swung round at him. "You don't think I've forgotten that, do you?" he said in a low voice. "You don't think that has been out of my mind?" His face was tense and drawn. I believe that Oliva is safe," he said quietly. "I believe that Oliva and not any of us here will deliver Van Heerden to justice." "Are you mad?" asked Kitson in astonishment. "I am very sane. Come here." He gripped the old lawyer by the arm and led him back to the girl's room. "Look," he said, and pointed. "What do you mean? The bookshelf?" Beale nodded. "Half an hour ago I gave Oliva a book," he said. "That book is no longer there." "But in the name of heaven, how can a book save her?" demanded the exasperated Kitson.
Stanford Beale did not answer. "Yes, yes, she's safe. I know she's safe," he said. "If Oliva is the girl I think she is, then I see Van Heerden's finish." End of chapter 30. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Section 31 of The Green Rust by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 31. A Cornchandler's Bill. The church bells were chiming 11 o'clock when a car drew up before a gloomy corner shop bearing the dingy sign of the pawnbrokers calling, and Beale and McNorton alighted. It was a main street and was almost deserted. Beale looked up at the windows. They were dark. He knocked at the side entrance of the shop, and presently the two men were joined by a policeman. "Nobody lives here, sir," explained the officer, when McNorton had made himself known. "Old Rosenblaum runs the business and lives at Highgate." He flashed his lamp upon the door and tried it, but it did not yield. A night-farer who had been in the shade on the opposite side of the street came across and volunteered information. He had seen another car drive up and a gentleman had alighted. He had opened the door with a key and gone in. There was nothing suspicious about him. He was quite a gentleman and was in evening dress. The constable thought it was one of the partners of Rosenblaum in convivial and resplendent garb. He had been in the house 10 minutes, then had come out again, locking the door behind him, and had driven off just before Beale's car had arrived. It was not until half an hour later that an agitated little man brought by the police from Highgate admitted the two men. There was no need to make a long search. The moment the light was switched on in the shop, Beale made his discovery. On the broad counter lay a sheet of paper and a little heap of silver coins. He swept the money aside and read: "For the redemption of one silver hunter, 10 shillings 6 pence." It was signed in the characteristic handwriting that Beale knew so well: Van Heerden, M.D. The two men looked at one another. "What do you make of that?" asked McNorton. Beale carried the paper to the light and examined it, and McNorton went on: "He's a pretty cold fellow. I suppose he had the money and the message all ready for our benefit." Beale shook his head. "On the contrary," he said, "this was done on the spur of the moment. A piece of bravado which occurred to him when he had the watch. Look at this paper. You can imagine him searching his pocket for a piece of waste paper and taking the first that came to his hand. It is written in ink with the pawnbroker's own pen. The inkwell is open." He lifted up the pen. "The nib is still wet," he said. McNorton took the paper from his hands. It was a bill from a cornchandler's at Horsham, the type of bill that was sent in days of war economy, which folded over and constituted its own envelope. It was addressed to J.B. Harden, Esquire. "That was the alias he used when he took the wine vaults at Paddington," explained McNorton, "and had been posted about a week before. Attached to the bottom of the account, which was for £3 10s, was a little slip calling attention to the fact that this account had probably been overlooked." Beale's finger traced the item for which the bill was rendered, and McNorton uttered an exclamation of surprise. "Curious, isn't it," said Beale, as he folded the paper and put it away in his pocket, "how these very clever men always make some trifling error which brings them to justice. I don't know how many great schemes I have seen brought to nothing through some such act of folly as this, some piece of theatrical bravado which benefited the criminal nothing at all." "Good gracious," said McNorton wonderingly. "Of course, that's what he is going to do. I never thought of that. It is in the neighbourhood of Horsham we must look for him, and I think if we can get one of the Messrs. Billingham out of bed in a couple of hours' time we shall do a good night's work." They went outside and again questioned the policeman. He remembered the car turning round and going back the way it had come. It had probably taken one of the innumerable side roads which lead from the main thoroughfare, and in this way they had missed it. "I want to go to the Megaphone office first," said Beale. "I have some good friends on that paper and I am curious to know how bad the markets are. The night cables from New York should be coming in by now." In his heart was a sickening fear which he dared not express. What would the morrow bring forth? If this one man's cupidity and hate should succeed in releasing the terror upon the world, what sort of a world would it leave? Through the windows of the car he could see the placid policemen patrolling the streets, caught a glimpse of other cars brilliantly illuminated, bearing their laughing men and women back to homes, who were ignorant of the monstrous danger which threatened their security and life. He passed the facades of great commercial mansions which in a month's time might but serve to conceal the stark ruin within. To him it was a night of tremendous tragedy. And for the second time in his life, in the numbness induced by the greater peril and the greater anxiety, he failed to wince at the thought of the danger in which Oliva stood. Indeed, analyzing his sensations, she seemed to him on this occasion less a victim than a fellow worker, and he found a strange comfort in that thought of partnership. The Megaphone buildings blazed with light when the car drew up to the door. Messenger boys were hurrying through the swing doors. The two great elevators were running up and down without pause. The gray editor with a gruff voice threw over a bundle of flimsies. "Here are the market reports," he growled. "They are not very encouraging." Beale read them and whistled, and the editor eyed him keenly. "Well, what do you make of it?" he asked the detective. "Wheat at $1 a pound already. God knows what it's going to be tomorrow." "Any other news?" asked Beale. "We have asked Germany to explain why she has prohibited the export of wheat and to give us a reason for the stocks she holds and the steps she has taken during the past 2 months to accumulate reserves." "An ultimatum?" "Not exactly an ultimatum. There's nothing to go to war about. The government has mobilized the fleet and the French government has partially mobilized her army. The question is," he said, "would war ease the situation?" Beale shook his head. "The battle will not be fought in the field," he said. "It will be fought right here in London, in all your great towns, in Manchester, Coventry, Birmingham, Cardiff. It will be fought in New York and in 1,000 townships between the Pacific and the Atlantic. And if the German scheme comes off we shall be beaten before a shot is fired." "What does it mean?" asked the editor. "Why is everybody buying wheat so frantically? There is no shortage. The harvests in the United States and Canada are good." "There will be no harvests," said Beale solemnly, and the journalist gaped at him. End of chapter 31. Read by Don W. Jenkins. Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com. Section 32 of The Green Rust by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 32. The End of Van Heerden. Dr. Van Heerden expected many things and was prepared for contingencies beyond the imagination of the normally minded, but he was not prepared to find in Oliva Cresswell a pleasant traveling companion. When a man takes a girl, against her will, from a pleasant suite at the best hotel in London, compels her at the peril of death to accompany him on a motor car ride in the dead of night, and when his offence is a duplication of one which had been committed less than a week before, he not unnaturally anticipates tears, supplications, or in the alternative a frigid and unapproachable silence. To his amazement, Oliva was extraordinarily cheerful and talkative and even amusing. He had kept Bridgers at the door of the car whilst he investigated the pawnbroking establishment of Messrs. Rosenblaum Brothers, and had returned in triumph to discover that the girl who up to then had been taciturn and uncommunicative was in quite an amiable mood. "I used to think," she said, "that motor car abductions were the invention of sensational writers, but you seem to make a practice of it. You are not very original, Dr. Van Heerden. I think I've told you that before." He smiled in the darkness as the car sped smoothly through the deserted streets. "I must plead guilty to being rather unoriginal," he said. But I promise you that this little adventure shall not end as did the last."
"It can hardly do that," she laughed. "I can only be married once whilst Mr. Beale is alive."
"I forgot you were married," he said suddenly. Then, after a pause, "I suppose you will divorce him?"
"Why?" she asked innocently.
"But you're not fond of that fellow, are you?"
"Passionately," she said calmly. "He is my ideal." The reply took away his breath and certainly silenced him. "How is this adventure to end?" she demanded. "Are you going to maroon me on a desert island, or are you taking me to Germany?"
"How did you know I am trying to get to Germany?" he asked sharply.
"Oh, Mr. Beale thought so," she replied in a tone of indifference. "He reckoned that he would catch you somewhere near the coast."
"He did he?" said the other calmly. "I shall deny him that pleasure. I don't intend taking you to Germany. Indeed, it is not my intention to detain you any longer than is necessary."
"For which I am truly grateful," she smiled. "But why detain me at all?"
"That is a stupid question to ask when I am sure you have no doubt in your mind as to why it is necessary to keep you close to me until I have finished my work. I think I told you some time ago," he went on, "that I had a great scheme. The other day you called me a Hun, by which I suppose you meant that I was a German. It is perfectly true that I am a German, and I am a patriotic German. To me, even in these days of his degradation, the Kaiser is still little less than a god." His voice quivered a little, and the girl was struck dumb with wonder that a man of such intelligence, of such wide outlook, of such modernity, should hold to views so archaic. "Your country ruined Germany. You have sucked us dry. To say that I hate England and hate America, for you Anglo-Saxons are one in your soulless covetousness, is to express my feelings mildly."
"But what is your scheme?" she asked.
"Briefly I will tell you, Miss Cresswell, that you may understand that to night you accompany history and are a participant in world politics. America and England are going to pay. They are going to buy corn from my country at the price that Germany can fix. It will be a price," he cried, and did not attempt to conceal his joy, "which will ruin the Anglo-Saxon people more effectively than they ruined Germany."
"But how?" she asked, bewildered.
"They are going to buy corn," he repeated, "at our price, corn which is stored in Germany."
"But what nonsense!" she said scornfully. "I don't know very much about harvests and things of that kind, but I know that most of the world's wheat comes from America and from Russia."
"The Russian wheat will be in German granaries," he said softly. "The American wheat there will be no American wheat."
And then his calmness deserted him. The story of the Green Rust burst out in a wild flood of language which was half German and half English. The man was beside himself, almost mad, and before his gesticulating hands she shrank back into the corner of the car. She saw his silhouette against the window, heard the roar and scream of his voice as he babbled incoherently of his wonderful scheme, and had to piece together as best she could his disconnected narrative. And then she remembered her work in Beale's office, the careful tabulation of American farms, the names of the sheriffs, the hotels where conveyances might be secured. So that was it. Beale had discovered the plot and had already moved to counter this devilish plan. And she remembered the man who had come to her room in mistake for Van Heerden's, and the phial of green sawdust he carried, and Beale's look of horror when he examined it. And suddenly she cried with such vehemence that his flood of talk was stopped. "Thank God! Oh, thank God!"
What do you mean?" he demanded suspiciously. "What are you thanking God about?"
"Oh, nothing, nothing." She was her eager, animated self. "Tell me some more. It is a wonderful story. It is true, is it not?"
"True?" he laughed harshly. "You shall see how true it is. You shall see the world lie at the feet of German science. Tomorrow the word will go forth. Look!" He clicked on a little electric light and held out his hand. In his palm lay a silver watch. "I told you there was a code." She was dimly conscious that he had spoken of a code, but she had been so occupied by her own thoughts that she had not caught all that he had said. "The code was in this watch. Look!" He pressed a knob and the case flew open. Pasted to the inside of the case was a circular piece of paper covered with fine writing. "When you found that ticket you had the code in your hands," he chuckled.
If you or your friends had the sense to redeem that watch, I could not have sent tomorrow the message of German liberation. See, it is very simple." He pointed with his finger and held the watch halfway to the roof that the light might better reveal the wording. "This word means proceed. It will go to all my chief agents. They will transmit it by telegram to hundreds of centers. By Thursday morning great stretches of territory where the golden corn was waving so proudly today will be blackened by wastes. By Saturday the world will confront its sublime catastrophe."
"But why have you 3 words?" she asked huskily.
"We Germans provide against all contingencies," he said. "We leave nothing to chance. We are not gamblers. We work on lines of scientific accuracy. The second word is to tell my agents to suspend operations until they hear from me. The third word means abandon the scheme for this year. We must work with the markets. A more favorable opportunity might occur. With so grand a conception, it is necessary that we should obtain the maximum results for our labors."
He snapped the case of the watch and put it back in his pocket, turned out the light and settled himself back with a sigh of content.
"You see, you are unimportant," he said. "You are a beautiful woman, and to many men you would be most desirable. To me you are just a woman, an ordinary fellow creature, amusing, beautiful, possessed of an agile mind, though somewhat frivolous by our standards. Many of my fellow countrymen who do not think like I do would take you. It is my intention to leave you just as soon as it is safe to do so, unless—" A thought struck him and he frowned. "Unless?" she repeated with a sinking heart, in spite of her assurance. "Bridgers was speaking to me of you. He who is driving." He nodded to the dimly outlined shoulders of the chauffeur. "He has been a faithful fellow."
"You wouldn't!" she gasped.
"Why not?" he said coolly. "I don't want you. Bridgers thinks that you are beautiful."
"Is he a Hun too?" she asked, and he jerked round toward her.
"If Bridgers wants you, he shall have you," he said harshly.
She knew she had made a mistake. There was no sense in antagonizing him, the more especially so since she had not yet learnt all that she wanted to know. "I think your scheme is horrible," she said after a while. "The wheat destruction scheme, I mean, not Bridgers, but it is a very great one." The man was susceptible to flattery, for he became genial again.
"It is the greatest scheme that has ever been known to science. It is the most colossal crime I suppose they call it a crime that has ever been committed."
"But how are you going to get your code word away? The telegraphs are in the hands of the government, and I think you will find it difficult even if you have a secret wireless."
"Wireless, bah!" he said scornfully. "I never expected to send it by telegraph with or without wires. I have a much surer way, Fräulein, as you will see."
"But how will you escape?" she asked.
"I shall leave England to morrow, soon after daybreak," he replied with assurance. "By aeroplane. A long distance flying machine will land on my Sussex farm, which will have British markings. Indeed, it is already in England. And I and my good Bridgers will pass your coast without trouble." He peered out of the window. "This is Horsham, I think," he said as they swept through what appeared to the girl to be a square. "That little building on the left is the railway station. You will see the signal lamps in a moment. My farm is about 5 miles down the Shoreham Road."
He was in excellent temper as they passed through the old town and mounted the hill which leads to Shoreham, was politeness itself when the car had turned off the main road and had bumped over cart tracks to the door of a large building.
"This is your last escapade, Miss Cresswell, or Mrs. Beale, I suppose I should call you," he said jovially, as he pushed her before him into a room where supper had been laid for 2. "You see, you were not expected, but you shall have Bridgers. It will be daylight in 2 hours," he said inconsequently. "You must have some wine." She shook her head with a smile, and he laughed as if the implied suspicion of her refusal was the best joke in the world. "Nein, nein, little friend," he said. "I shall not doctor you again. My days of doctoring have passed." She had expected to find the farm in occupation, but apparently they were the only people there. The doctor had opened the door himself with a key, and no servant had appeared, nor apparently did he expect them to appear. She learnt afterwards that there were 2 farm servants, an old man and his wife, who lived in a cottage on the estate, and came in the daytime to do the housework and prepare a cold supper against their master's coming. Bridgers did not make his appearance.
Apparently he was staying with his car. About 3 o'clock in the morning, when the first streaks of grey were showing in the sky, van Heerden rose to go in search of his assistant. Until then he had not ceased to talk of himself, of his scheme, of his great plan, of his early struggles, of his difficulties in persuading members of his government to afford him the assistance he required. As he turned to the door she checked him with a word. "I am immensely interested," she said, "but still you have not told me how you intend to send your message." "It is simple," he said, and beckoned to her. They passed out of the house into the chill, sweet dawn, made a half circuit of the farm, and came to a courtyard surrounded on three sides by low buildings. He opened a door to reveal another door covered with wire netting. "Behold!" he laughed. "Pigeons," said the girl. The dark interior of the shed was aflicker with white wings. "Pigeons," repeated van Heerden, closing the door, "and every one knows his way back to Germany. It has been a labour of love collecting them. And they are all British," he said with a laugh. "There I will give the British credit. They know more about pigeons than we Germans, and have used them more in the war." "But suppose your pigeon is shot down or falls by the way?" she asked, as they walked slowly back to the house. "I shall send 50," replied van Heerden calmly. "Each will carry the same message, and some at least will get home." Back in the dining room he cleared the remains of the supper from the table and went out of the room for a few minutes, returning with a small pad of paper. And she saw from the delicacy with which he handled each sheet that it was of the thinnest texture. Between each page he placed a carbon and began to write, printing the characters. There was only one word on each tiny sheet. When this was written he detached the leaves, putting them aside and using his watch as a paperweight, and wrote another batch. She watched him, fascinated, until he showed signs that he had completed his task. Then she lifted the little valise which she had at her side, put it on her knees, opened it and took out a book. It must have been instinct which made him raise his eyes to her. "What have you got there?" he asked sharply. "Oh, a book," she said, with an attempt at carelessness. "But why have you got it? You are not reading." He leant over and snatched it from her and looked at the title. "A Friend in Need," he read, "by Stanford Beale." "By Stanford Beale," he repeated, frowning. "I didn't know your husband wrote books." She made no reply. He turned back the cover and read the title page. "But this is Smiles's Self-Help," he said. "It's the same thing," she replied. He turned another page or two, then stopped, for he had come to a place where the center of the book had been cut right out. The leaves had been glued together to disguise this fact, and what was apparently a book was in reality a small box. "What was in there?" he asked, springing to his feet. "This," she said. "Don't move, Dr. van Heerden." The little hand which held the Browning was firm and did not quiver. "I don't think you are going to send your pigeons off this morning, Doctor," she said. "Stand back from the table." She leant over and seized the little heap of papers and the watch. "I'm going to shoot you," she said steadily, "if you refuse to do as I tell you, because if I don't shoot you, you will kill me." His face had grown old and grey in the space of a few seconds. The white hands he raised were shaking. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse murmur came. Then his face went blank. He stared at the pistol, then stretched out his hand slowly toward it. "Stand back!" she cried. He jumped at her and she pulled the trigger, but nothing happened, and the next minute she was struggling in his arms. The man was hysterical with fear and relief and was giggling and cursing in the same breath. He wrenched the pistol from her hand and threw it on the table. "You fool! You fool!" he shouted. "The safety catch! You didn't put it down!" She could have wept with anger and mortification. Beale had put the catch of the weapon at safety, not realizing that she did not understand the mechanism of it, and van Heerden in one lightning glance had seen his advantage. "Now you suffer," he said as he flung her in a chair. "You shall suffer, I tell you. I will make an example of you. I will leave your husband something which he will not touch." He was shaking in every limb. He dashed to the door and bellowed, "Bridgers!" Presently she heard a footstep in the hall. "Come, my friend," van Heerden shouted. "You shall have your wish. It is..." "How are you going, van Heerden? Quietly or rough?" He spun round. There were two men in the doorway. The first of these was Beale. "It's no use your shouting for Bridgers, because Bridgers is on the way to the jug," said McNorton. "I have a warrant for you, van Heerden." The doctor turned with a howl of rage, snatched up the pistol which lay on the table and thumbed down the safety catch. Beale and McNorton fired together so that it seemed like a single shot that thundered through the room. Van Heerden slid forward and fell sprawling across the table. It was the Friday morning, and Beale stepped briskly through the vestibule of the Ritz Carlton, and declining the elevator went up the stairs, two at a time. He burst into the room where Kitson and the girl were standing by the window. "Wheat prices are tumbling down," he said. "The message worked." "Thank heaven for that," said Kitson. "Then Van Heerden's code message telling his gang to stop operations reached its destination." "Its destinations," corrected Beale cheerfully. "I released 30 pigeons with the magic word. The agents have been arrested," he said. "We notified the government authorities, and there was a sheriff or a policeman in every post office when the code word came through. Van Heerden's agents saw some curious telegraph messengers yesterday." Kitson nodded and turned away. "What are you going to do now?" asked the girl, with a light in her eyes. "You must feel quite lost without this great quest of yours." "There are others," said Stanford Beale. "When do you return to America?" she asked. He fenced the question, but she brought him back to it. "I have a great deal of business to do in London before I go," he said. "Like what?" she asked. "Well," he hesitated, "I have some legal business." "Are you suing somebody?" she asked, wilfully dense. He rubbed his head in perplexity. "To tell you the truth," he said, "I don't exactly know what I've got to do or what sort of figure I shall cut. I have never been in the divorce court before." "Divorce court?" she said, puzzled. "Are you giving evidence? Of course I know detectives do that sort of thing. I have read about it in the newspapers. It must be rather horrid, but you are such a clever detective. Oh, by the way, you never told me how you found me." "It was a very simple matter," he said, relieved to change the subject. "Van Heerden, by one of those curious lapses which the best of criminals make, left a message at the pawnbroker's which was written on the back of an account for pigeon food, sent to him from a Horsham tradesman. I knew he would not try to dispatch his messages by the ordinary courses, and I suspected all along that he had established a pigeon post. The bill gave me all the information I wanted. It took us a long time to find the tradesman, but once we had discovered him he directed us to the farm. We took along a couple of local policemen and arrested Bridgers in the garage." She shivered. "It was horrible, wasn't it?" she said. He nodded. "It was rather dreadful, but it might have been very much worse," he added philosophically. "But how wonderful of you to switch yourself from the crime of that enthralling character to a commonplace divorce suit." "This isn't commonplace," he said. "It is rather a curious story." "Do tell me." She made a place for him on the window ledge, and he sat down beside her. "It is a story of a mistake and a blunder," he said. "The plaintiff, a very worthy young man, passably good looking, was a man of my profession, a detective engaged in protecting the interests of a young and beautiful girl." "I suppose you have to say she's young and beautiful, or the story wouldn't be interesting," she said. "It is not necessary to lie in this case," he said. "She is certainly young and undoubtedly beautiful. She has the loveliest eyes." "Go on," she said hastily. "The detective," he resumed, "hereinafter called the petitioner, desiring to protect the innocent maiden from the machinations of a fortune hunting gentleman no longer with us, contracted as he thought a fraudulent marriage with this unfortunate girl, believing thereby he could choke off the villain who was pursuing her." "But why did the unfortunate girl marry him, even fraudulently?" "Because," said Beale, "the villain of the piece had drugged her, and she didn't know what she was doing. After the marriage," he went on, "he discovered that, so far from being illegal, it was good in law, and he had bound this wretched female." "Please don't be rude," she said. "He had bound this wretched female to him for life. Being a perfect gentleman, born of poor but American parents, he takes the first opportunity of freeing her." "And himself," she murmured. "As to the poor misguided lad," he said firmly, "you need feel no sympathy. He had behaved disgracefully." "How?" she asked. "Well, you see, he had already fallen in love with her, and that made his offence all the greater. If you go red I cannot tell you this story, because it embarrasses me." "I haven't gone red," she denied indignantly. "So what are you what is he going to do?" Beale shrugged his shoulders. "He is going to work for a divorce." "But why?" she demanded. "What has she done?" He looked at her in astonishment. "What do you mean?" he stammered. "Well," she shrugged her shoulders slightly and smiled in his face, "it seems to me that it is nothing to do with him. It is the wretched female who should sue for a divorce, not the handsome detective. Do you feel faint?" "No," he said hoarsely. "Don't you agree with me?" "I agree with you," said the incoherent Beale, "but suppose her guardian takes the necessary steps?" She shook her head. "The guardian can do nothing unless the wretched female instructs him," she said. "Does it occur to you that even the best of drugs wear off in time, and that there is a possibility that the lady was not as unconscious of the ceremony as she pretends? Of course," she said hurriedly, "she did not realize that it had actually happened, and until she was told by Apollo from the Central Office that's what you call Scotland Yard in New York, isn't it? That the ceremony had actually occurred, she was under the impression that it was a beautiful dream. When I say beautiful," she amended in some hurry, "I mean not unpleasant." "Then what am I to do?" said the helpless Beale. "Wait till I divorce you," said old Eva, and turned her head hurriedly so that Beale only kissed the tip of her ear. End of Chapter 32. End of The Green Rust by Edgar Wallace. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com